Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on classics in neuroscience. We have been looking at learning and memory. In the past few videos, we looked at the limbic system. We'll continue our discussion of the limbic system. In this video, we'll continue our discussion on the limbic system. Specifically, we'll focus our attention on amygdala, so important nucleus responsible for emotional behavior, and compare renencephalon and the limbic system, how the nose brain was somehow forgotten and the limbic system took over what was mostly earlier called as the nose brain. Amygdala is located in the cerebral cortex at the base of the forebrain in lower mammals and on the medial wall of the base of the temporal lobe in higher mammals. A slight difference in location, not really very different. So, it is located at the base of the temporal lobe in higher mammals. Remember, Kluwer and Bucy, they reported that a monkey that had the temporal lobe, the entire temporal lobe removed on both sides, an aggressive monkey became tame and calm. It became a very nice friendly monkey maybe. But are these results replicable? Apparently, these results were replicable in the sense that these changes to these structures did cause change in emotional behavior. To that extent, the results were replicable, but not the exact change that was reported by Kluwer and Bucy. Because what Kluwer and Bucy found was that aggressive monkeys became tame and calm. But what happened in cat, for example, the removal of amygdala made them savage, made them really extremely aggressive, for example. So, this shows that ablation, just cutting away tissues, is a very crude tool. So, you cannot really come to firm conclusions of function with a crude technique like ablation, just eroding away tissues, just killing tissues otherwise. A more useful way, a more practical way, something that is more precise would be to use focal electrical stimulation, but the key here is focal. Perhaps this would not have been possible in the early part of the 20th century. It must have happened only much later, because the ability to focally stimulate the central nervous system or the brain is something that was developed only later. The technology was developed only much later. Okay. This is where Paul MacLean comes into the picture. Paul MacLean was born in 1913. He studied at Yale and he was interested in philosophy, but he continued his medical education, I suppose, and he received his MD in Yale in 1940. After World War II, he started practicing privately in psychiatry, but was soon super excited and was inspired to find the brain mechanisms that underlie psychiatric disease. And he took a fellowship with Stanley Cobb at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Let's take a few seconds to also mention that this place, the Massachusetts General Hospital, became an excellent breeding ground for budding neuropsychiatrists. So, this was a field, this was a place where a lot of young extraordinary scientists working in this neuropsychiatry field were all converging. So, it is a great place to work. So, while studying patients with epilepsy, he was interested, he was drawn to their emotional experience and what would be a possible role to temporal lobe and hippocampus. What would be a potential role of the temporal lobe and hippocampus was the question that he asked. Of course, he read with much interest the paper by Pepys, James Pepys. And after meeting Pepys once, after the visit of Pepys, MacLean put together all the studies of his patients in the 1949 paper that he called as psychosomatic disease and the visceral brain. It's a particular name he gives, visceral. Recent developments bearing on the Pepys theory of emotion. Why is he calling it as a visceral brain? Because he was not interested in calling this part of the brain as rhinencephalon or the nose brain. He would much rather call it as the visceral brain. A crucial part of MacLean's original paper was the idea that mammalian brains may have some commonality with more primitive brains. So, there might be some primitive system that is responsible for merely integrating sensory information, essentially suggesting a dichotomy between our intellectual, intelligent, rational behavior and more emotional, non-verbal, less rational behavior. So, this formed the cornerstone of what was later to become MacLean's future theories. So, essentially there is this rational, intellectual, intelligent brain, and then there is this less intelligent, more emotional, less rational brain. Not two different brains, it is the same brain, two different nuclei, two different circuitry, two different systems pertaining to two different aspects of our experience. So, this became a cornerstone. He would continue this line of work. Paper by MacLean essentially invited the attention of John Fulton, whose work with Carlyle Jacobson at Yale at around the same time, and he was working on how the lesions to the frontal lobe and its relation to emotion. So, essentially he was working on frontal lobe and the relationship of the frontal lobe with emotion. This line of work by Fulton essentially led to the development of psychosurgery. This is a topic that we will discuss in future videos and in future weeks. At Yale, MacLean became interested in the work of Broca and what Broca would call as the limbic lobe. So, remember, in the good old days, the limbic system was essentially called as the nose brain, because somehow it was thought that the olfactory system was practically not very relevant to higher mammals, especially humans. It has practically very little relevance. Somehow this system became the Cinderella or the unwanted child in the field of brain anatomy and physiology. So, somehow it was thought that okay, olfactory system, who cares about olfactory system? Humans do not need such a very powerful olfactory system, or perhaps do not have such a powerful olfactory system, was a thought process. So, this was the unwanted child or the Cinderella of the brain anatomy, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, neuropsychology fields. Somehow MacLean was very convinced about Broca's use of the word limbic instead of using the word rhinencephalon, or the use of his own word which he himself used, visceral. Instead of these two words, MacLean found that limbic was a more relevant word to use as used by Paul Broca. So, eventually Paul MacLean developed his ideas into what is now called as a triune brain. This essentially implied that there are three brains. It is a single brain composed of three different nuclei or three different types of functions, composed of a reptile brain, a lower mammal brain and a human brain. These are all present in the same brain, united, but somehow the verbal human cortex is not able to communicate effectively with the lower non-verbal primitive brain. Somehow the verbal human cortex is unable to communicate effectively with the non-verbal primitive reptile and lower mammal brains. So, this line of research pursued by Paul MacLean essentially brought people's attention to the structures and functions within the limbic system of individual components within the limbic system. So, somehow the unwanted child started receiving the attention that she probably deserved, particularly the hippocampus and the amygdala. For the longest time, these were ignored or sidelined as a nose brain, who cares about olfaction type. So, somehow the idea that there was this three components, for example, of behavior, and the idea that somehow amygdala formed part of the emotional circuitry brought a lot of attention, plenty of attention to this field. So, for example, in his work with Jose Delgado, MacLean performed a study showing the role of focal electrical stimulation in amygdala that evoked different types of visceral and emotional expressions depending on where you are stimulating. Important to show that. So, different regions of the amygdala stimulation leads to different kinds of emotional expressions, essentially suggesting maybe amygdala plays a causal role in emotion. So, this groundbreaking study, seminal study authored by Delgado and MacLean, essentially started the explosion of studies that investigated the functional characteristics of this region of the brain, which is the limbic lobe, especially the amygdala and the hippocampus. So, this part of the brain then became a region of constant and explosive interest and current interest for its role in the emotional experience of mammals, in particular humans. Jose Delgado also performed a popular stunt sort of thing when he implanted electrodes into the brain of a bull, and when the bull was raging to attack him, he essentially pushed a button that started sending electric currents through those electrodes. Then the bull became calm and quiet. So, although later it was shown that it was not due to any particular effect that it had on any particular circuit, but rather the bull became generally very averse to the high amount of electric shock it was receiving. That was later shown, but he achieved more publicity with this stunt than with his paper with Paul MacLean. Unfortunately, this is how it always happens. So, this received a lot of publicity because he was able to demonstrate the role of deep brain stimulation to control behavior. That's important this. So, later it was shown that these electrodes were not placed where they were supposed to be placed, and infection had happened around them, and the turning of the bull was essentially due to a generally averse behavior to the brain being subjected to a lot of electrical stimulation. So, that was all there was, but this achieved a lot of fame, what would today be called as YouTube viral or Instagram viral. This became viral in the good old days. So, instead of his paper, he became famous for this video or for this little short movie. So, traditionally renencephalan was thought to play a crucial role in the evolution of forebrain according to comparative neuroanatomists. MacLean's work essentially changed this idea. It highlighted the new functions of renencephalan related to emotion and ultimately to memory. This did encourage new research, especially on emotional responses and emotional experience, but the problem was already olfaction or smell was assigned not that much importance in this field. smell was relegated to even lesser significant role in the mammalian and human behavior than it already it was not having much, it was given even lesser role, for example, when compared with vision and hearing. For example, anatomical studies showed removal of the olfactory bulb caused degenerating fibers that reached out only to the piriform cortex, stopping short of the hippocampus, showing that hippocampus was practically not part of the nose brain or the renencephalon, it had some other function perhaps. So, hippocampus was then removed from playing a significant role in olfaction, and the key functions were now related to the central connections, and the functions are related to memory and emotions, and because they are part of the brain system that composes the limbic system. For most neuroscientists, the sense of smell essentially faded into insignificance. No, I mean, nobody really, already it was not such an important topic, it continued to fade in the memory of neuroscientists in the mammalian brain until the discovery of the olfactory genes that happened in the early 1990s. So, with this we come to the end of this video. In this video we continued our discussion on the limbic system. Specifically, we discussed the work of Paul MacLean and his work in bringing to fore the role of the limbic system in the emotional experience, specifically on amygdala, and how his work in collaboration with Jose Delgado became a crucial cornerstone study using focal electrical stimulation to change emotional behavior and emotional experience, and how the role of renencephalon or the nose brain became even lesser after the studies of Paul MacLean. With this we end this video. Thank you for your attention.